Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is our seventh installment in our Anti-Racism in Practice series. I'm very excited that we are starting a 4-month arc looking at racism and differential policing and prosecution and sentencing over these next 4 months, January, February, March, into April, even stemming into environmental justice toward the end. So thank you all for joining us today. So I'm Scott Jackson, by the way. I am the executive director of Shakespeare at Notre Dame, as well as one of the co-founders of the Shakespeare in Prisons Network. And I'm so happy to have you all here today. So as we get started, obviously, there's me, Scott Jackson. Kate Powers is with us again today. Melinda Cooper is actually moving cross country. I think she's probably somewhere in like New Mexico today. So she's not able to join us for this session, but we definitely want to bring her name into it because she's been an indispensable partner in this series together. So our agenda today, obviously pretty loose. I'm not going to take 10 minutes for this introduction by any stretch because I want to give Kate as much time as I can. We will then move into Kate's formal presentation about broken windows policing. Then open it up with whatever remainder of time we have for a group discussion, and then talk about next steps and what's coming up next on January 25th. So, as always, we have some agreements here when we are presenting the anti-racism sessions. We respect confidentiality. We speak from our own experiences. We speak from the I, not the we. We stay engaged, listening to one another, video on as much as possible. We, as usual, get comfortable being uncomfortable. We monitor our own participation. So if suddenly we seem like we're maybe talking a little bit too much, let's self-select ourselves to be quiet for a bit. Remember that none of us are experts, although I think Kate Powers now is definitely an expert. So please be open. This is part of our anti-racist practice too, in presenting these sessions to you. So have empathy for ourselves and for others, and allow ourselves to face plant when necessary to learn publicly. We're going to focus on whiteness as a racial category, not as the norm. We're going to encourage contributions from everyone. So please feel free to speak up, whether that's in the chat. And this will be a pretty informal discussion as well. So questions are definitely encouraged. And expect and accept non-closure. Racial understanding wants ongoing dialogue. We're not going to solve this by any stretch. We're only dealing with, I think, the last 2 or 3 decades of differential policing today. And as Kate will tell you, the first instance in the United States started in 1604. So our goals are to commit to dismantling white supremacy within our society, within our programs, within our university departments, and our theater companies, and within ourselves, most importantly, because change begins within. We know we're not going to solve this in an hour, and we are committed to developing an anti-racist practice, just as we have a practice around meditation or going to the gym, because lives literally depend on it. It becomes a daily priority. And we also acknowledge that we don't get a cookie for showing up just to do the work of racial justice. I'd also like us to, if you are so inclined, where did my chat go? There it goes. To go ahead and place a land acknowledgement for your neck of the woods here in the chat, if you're so inclined. And I'll give everybody a moment to do that. And then moving on, just to give you a few dates in advance. So December 28th, obviously, is today. We're going to be talking about the role of policing, focusing in on the 1994 crime bill, as well as broken windows, policing theory, et cetera, et cetera. On January 25th, we're going to then move on to the role of prosecution and differential prosecution and what happens to non-white individuals that are faced with prosecution. On February 22nd, we're going to then move on to the prison system itself and what kind of systemic racism is just kind of baked in to our prison system. Similarly, on March 29th, we'll do the same thing with reentry in the reentry system. And then in April, we haven't figured out that date just yet, but we're going to move on to the role of environmental justice and how that plays into everything that we're talking about today and in these future sessions. I believe, Kate, that this is your cue now to take over from me.
Okay, so we're going to try to talk about a whole bunch of categories of things here today, starting with the concept of differential policing. Agree on some definitions together, right, for these things. We're going to talk about differential policing, racial profiling, broken windows theory, stop and frisk, the impact of the 1994 crime bill, and what we mean when we say defund the police. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Scott.
On it.
So we come to differential policing very much in progress with these topics. This is easily a semester-length seminar-sized topic, and we're only going to just begin to get at it. In 1640, 3 indentured servants in Virginia were caught as they attempted to run away. 2 of them were of European descent, and they had 4 years tacked onto their contract of service as punishment for trying to run away. The African gentleman, John Punch, was sentenced to servitude for life. So this is maybe the beginning of differential policing in this country, right? This is the beginning of dividing poor white people from poor Black people and leveraging the difference in skin tone in order to keep poor white people happy that at least they weren't Black. In 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, which we probably all heard about in elementary school, but are like, yeah, what was that again? It's the first insurrection by sort of poor and working class colonists against landowners. So poor colonists, white and Black, fight together under the leadership of Nathaniel Bacon. Side note, Nathaniel Bacon, not a great guy, but that's for a separate time. So white European planters after the rebellion enact laws decreeing that Africans will hereafter be hereditary slaves. So they begin legislating the racial caste of slavery. They say that they want to, quote, prevent future interracial solidarity. So again, this divide and conquer idea. And we see this all the way down, right, from 1640 on, right? So between 1689 and 1865, there's over 130 statutes that are intertwined with oppressing Black people while giving some tiny shred of privilege or opportunity to white people, right? Then we get slave patrols, we get Reconstruction, we get Black codes, and the area of mass incarceration. We get Richard Nixon and Lee Atwater and the Southern Strategy, race talk shifting from the overtly racist language earlier in the 20th century to dog whistle phrases like law and order and the war on drugs. And that brings us to the next slide, which is the 1994 crime bill. So the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, also known as the crime bill or the Clinton crime bill, or often the Biden crime bill, was the largest crime bill in the history of the United States, 356 pages long, 100,000 new police officers, 9.7 billion in funding for prisons, 6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs, which were designed with significant input from police officers. Expanded federal law in several ways. So in there is the federal assault weapons ban, which was great, but has since been allowed to lapse. Other parts of the act provided for an expanded federal death penalty, new classes of individuals banned from possessing firearms, and a variety of new crimes that were defined relating to gang-related crime, sex crimes, and also hate crimes. Also required registries for sex offenders, and impose tougher sentences at the federal level and encourage states to do the same by offering them money to build prisons and implement what were called truth in sentencing laws. So truth in sentencing is a contributing factor to the development of mass incarceration. One used to be able to work one's way to a shorter actual sentence through good behavior, through periodic review. But the truth in sentencing policies created an environment where convicted felons had to serve at least 85% of the time on their sentence before they were eligible for parole or for a review. Three strikes laws were likewise contributing to mass incarceration. Jeremy Travis at the National Institute of Justice described truth in sentencing provisions of this law this way. He said, quote, "Here's the federal government coming in and saying, we'll give you money if you punish more people more severely. And 28 states and the District of Columbia followed the money and enacted stricter sentencing laws for violent offenses." The Justice Policy Institute said, quote, "The Clinton administration's tough on crime policies resulted in the largest increases in federal and state inmate populations of any president in American history. And much more aggressive policing grows out of this bill." Random side note, for much of American history, since the time of the colonies, drunkenness was the single most frequently punished crime. It was called, I love this, the plankton of the criminal sea. But as enforcement and conviction for alcohol-related crimes began to wane around the time of Prohibition, punishment for drug-related activities increased. So the public drunkenness charges were mostly misdemeanors. The new drug charges are felonies. So felonies mean longer prison stays. They mean that stays with you for the rest of your life. And given that Black people are much more likely to be arrested for drugs, even though they are not more likely to use or sell them, they are disproportionately impacted by this change in what we are most likely to enforce, right? One example of that is, and the most famous example of that is probably the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine deal, right? So at the time of the 1994 crime bill, the ratio of punishment for crack cocaine to powder cocaine, which are chemically identical, was almost 500 to 1, right? And after the 2010 Fair Sentencing Act, we managed, President Obama and his colleagues in Congress got that down to 18 to 1, but it's still a huge disparity, right? So that is a super quick overview of the crime bill. And I guess I just want to add, and for us to think about as we continue this conversation, Joe Biden wrote a great amount of that 1994 crime bill, and he advocated for it, and he was very proud of, he remains very proud of a lot of the work that he did on that, and he has rethought his position on some of the things that he talked about in that bill. But our president-elect has some accounting to do as well, right? So differential policing. Next slide, if you would, Scott. So this term means a few different things, but for our understanding, we're talking about the ways that police patrol and engage predominantly Black and Latinx communities differently. Black respondents to a prison policy survey were more likely to be stopped by police than white or Latinx respondents, and both Black and Latinx respondents were more likely to be stopped multiple times within a given year than were white respondents. That's street stops as well as traffic stops. More than 1 in 6 Black residents who are pulled over in a traffic stop or stopped on the street had multiple engagements with the police, and they are more likely to experience either the threat of force or an actual use of force. And part of what this does is it colors how we all understand what's happening, right? So white people primarily get stopped by the police and then go about their business at some point, and they're less likely to have that threat or that use of force coming at them. So that means for a lot of white people, they think when a Black person or a brown person is threatened with or experiences violence in that encounter with the police, for what some white people, the thinking is, well, they must have done something to deserve it because the police didn't do that to me when I got pulled over. The police officer was perfectly polite to me. And so you're letting your own experience shape how you are seeing what's happening to people with a different lived experience. Great. So the other thing about this is that these disparate experiences have impacts on public trust in the police, right? So for Black and brown communities, they are much less likely to call the police if they need help. They're much less likely to trust, whereas white people are more likely to see police use of force as legit and more likely to seek help from the police. Yeah. Next slide, please. So this is just some data from the Prison Policy Initiative talking about how the police are twice as likely to use of force against people of color. Yeah. So broken windows. George Kelling and James Wilson devised the broken windows theory, which states that visible signs of crime and antisocial behavior create an urban environment that encourages further crime and disorder. The idea being that if authorities could catch would-be offenders perpetrating petty thefts like vandalism or jumping a subway turnstile, you could head off or deter more serious acts of criminal behavior. This essay appeared in The Atlantic in 1982, I believe. Wilson and Kelling's essay provided the framework for police departments across the country to shift their mission from solely responding to emergency calls to also trying to help communities deal with the kind of disorder that leads to the breakdown of community control. But when their ideas were translated into strategies to deal with disorder during a time of soaring crime and violence in the US, far from bringing residents and police together, broken windows policing became a wedge that worsened already strained relationships between communities of color, particularly, and the police. Kelling said on NPR in 2016, he said, "Not all fare beaters are criminals, but a lot of criminals were fare beaters. Turns out serious criminals are pretty busy. They commit minor offenses as well as major offenses." So one unintended consequence of implementing this theory in this way was to risk alienating communities that contained the broken windows. So this leads us to stop and frisk, which according to Bernard Harcourt at Columbia University Law said, if you can catch them committing the minor infraction to stop the more significant crime, why even wait for the misdemeanor? So we immediately see a sharp increase in police misconduct, right, with broken windows. You see a tremendous amount of disorder that actually erupts as a result of the broken windows policing. Not that the broken windows policing is responding to, but because the police are omnipresent, because they are constantly looking for Black and brown young men to cause trouble, they create the tension in the neighborhood and then kids pop off, right, in response. So we've got some more sources. If you want to learn more about that, we'll have some sources at the end that you can go investigate. Next slide, please. So in Chicago, criminologists Robert Sampson and Stephen Raudenbush analyzed what makes people perceive social disorder. So they found that if two neighborhoods had exactly the same amount of graffiti and loitering and litter, people perceived more disorder, more broken windows in neighborhoods where more African-American people lived. George Kelling, who wrote the broken windows theory, was not an advocate of stop and frisk. In 1982, he and Wilson wrote, quote, "How do we ensure that the police do not become the agents of neighborhood bigotry? We can offer no wholly satisfactory answer to this question." Right? And indeed, we see that as the theory is implemented, we get neighborhood bigotry happening, right? In August of 2013, a federal district court found that New York City's stop and frisk policy, which we're going to talk about in a second, was unconstitutional because of the way that it singled out Black and Hispanic young men. In 2013, New York also elected its apparently nominally first liberal mayor in 20 years, Bill de Blasio. And he celebrated the end of stop and frisk, but he did not do away with broken windows policing. And in fact, he reappointed Rudy Giuliani's police commissioner, Bill Bratton. 7 months after Bratton resumed leadership of the NYPD, broken windows policy came under fresh scrutiny because of the death of Eric Garner, who had been racially profiled and stopped and frisked repeatedly. Okay, so next slide, please. Racial profiling is the use of race or ethnicity as grounds for pulling someone over, stopping a person on the sidewalk, or initiating questioning. So law enforcement personnel, in theory, needed probable cause to stop and search someone. But the bar was lowered because of a Supreme Court case in 1968 that allowed law enforcement to stop and search people in a public place if the officer, quote, reasonably suspects that someone is about to commit a crime and can articulate a valid reason for that stop and frisk. So the individual officer decides who he reasonably suspects. And officers overwhelmingly use suspicious behavior when interacting with whites and use skin tone as the metric for interacting with Black people. And that's racial profiling, right? In 2008, police in New York City made 250,000 stops for what they called furtive movement. 1/15 of 1%. We say that again. 1/15 of 1% of those 250,000 stops turned up a weapon. In 2010, near the peak of the city's use of stop and frisk, Black residents in New York were 8 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white residents and 11 times more likely to be frisked. Black and Latinx folks made up 85% of all people stopped and frisked in New York City. Women are also subject to racial profiling, use of excessive force, and any number of violations of their rights and dignity by police. Women make up an increasing share of arrests and report much more use of force than they did 20 years ago. And so we see women's rising share of arrests and other police contact has received less attention and policy response. Within Black Lives Matter, we see this with the kind of say her name initiative and hashtag, right? That we tend to turn out in the streets when Black men are murdered. It's a bigger fight to lift up the names of Black women who've been murdered. Yeah. Let's see. What else do I want to tell you about that? Oh, so stop and frisk also violates the Fourth Amendment Equal Protection Clause, as well as freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. And the other problem with stop and frisk and racial profiling is it often leads police to miss actual crimes and actual offenders because they're so busy profiling that something else is going on over here and they don't see it, right? So the implicit bias that the cops are bringing to their work blinds them to something that might actually be going down. Does that make sense? Everybody with me so far? I know this is a ton of information. Okay, so next slide, please. So US police kill civilians at a much higher rate than police in other wealthy countries. This data comes from the Prison Policy Initiative. There's no question that the number of police killings of civilians in the United States who are disproportionately Black or other people of color are the result of policies and practices that enable and encourage police violence. Compared to police in other wealthy democracies, American police, as you can see, kill civilians at incredibly high rates. This is the most apples to apples comparison we can make. Yeah. Okay, next slide. So defund the police does not mean abolish the police. And there's been a lot of talk. I'm sure many people on the call have participated in some of these conversations or have heard some of these conversations going on this year. And a lot of white people who say that they are allies are using language like, gosh, I wish we wouldn't call it defund the police. I feel like that language is kind of problematic. And so I just want to uplift the idea that it's our job as allies or accomplices to decide where we want to invest and where we want to put our bodies on the line. It is not for us to tone police African-American activists, right? African-American activists came up with the phrase defund the police. So saying as a white ally, gosh, I wish we could call it something else, is a form of white fragility, right? It makes me uncomfortable. So could you maybe like change your activism so that it's less uncomfortable for me? Does that make sense? Yeah. So what defund the police does mean is to reallocate or redirect funding away from the police department and towards other government agencies. This is not about individual officers. This is about a system. This is about a profoundly racist system, right? So defunding the police highlights fiscal responsibility, advocates for you might think of a more market-driven approach to taxpayer money, and has some serious benefits in terms of reducing police violence and crime. Data shows, and this data is coming from the Brookings Institute, 9 out of 10 calls to 911 are for nonviolent encounters. That doesn't mean an incident might not turn violent, but police at times contribute to escalating the situation, right? We've all seen, well, I don't want to say we've all seen, I only want to speak for myself. I have certainly seen a lot of video, right, where clearly the police showing up has aggravated the situation. Police officers' skill sets and training are out of sync with a lot of the social interactions that they have. They are mostly trained in use of force tactics and worst case scenarios to reduce potential threats. Advocates for the defund movement like Philip McHarris and Thenway McHarris argue that shifting funding to social services that can improve such things as mental health, addiction, and homelessness could be a better use of taxpayer money. This approach further enhances the push to decriminalize and destigmatize people with mental health conditions or addiction problems. Police officers also are not as successful as many of us might think at solving violent crime. So the Brookings Institute had a team that said, you know, many of us tend to notice when a police officer is not charged in an extrajudicial killing. For instance, the murder of Breonna Taylor, right? No one's been charged. We noticed that, but that is actually in sync with a whole bunch of other violent crimes that have gone unsolved. So each year in this country, approximately, I'm sorry, I got to read this to you because the numbers in me, not pretty. Approximately 38% of murders, 66% of rapes, 70% of robberies, and 47% of aggravated assaults go uncleared every year. So the idea that the police are by default keeping us safer is maybe an idea that bears some interrogation. Yeah. Next slide, please. So how would defunding work? I put up here just a couple, 3 examples of things that are already happening in the country around defunding. So you can all read, so I won't read them to you. But fundamentally, it's about saying, do we need to give the police quite as much money as they have? Maybe the police could make do with a smaller budget, and we could create or take some of that money to do some other things in the community, right? Many of us, particularly white people, have been taught to equate policing with public safety. And it's hard for some of us to imagine alternatives to a punitive law enforcement model. But our criminal legal system was built to reinforce this deep structural racism in our society, right? And so for lots of communities of color, policing is about terror rather than safety. So the murders of George Floyd, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, these things are not anomalies. They are evidence of a racist system, right? And as we said in the previous slide, as white allies and accomplices, we need to figure out how to intervene in a conversation when people start to say, oh, it's just a few bad apples, right? The system is rotten to the core. It is not about individuals. It is about a system, yeah? Police forces are not neutral. The institution is inherently biased. Police forces have also become more militarized. Since 1990, the federal government has transferred $6 billion of excess military equipment to local police forces. We've seen that in Ferguson. We saw that in Minneapolis this summer. A lot of police, including Derek Chauvin, who knelt on the neck of George Floyd for more than 8 minutes, have taken what's called warrior training, which teaches them to see every encounter as potentially life-threatening, particularly when those encounters involve people of color. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you about that? In Minneapolis and other US cities, body cameras and other reform measures were implemented as part of the Obama administration's response to the call for police accountability. And body cameras have proven to be largely ineffective. They are regularly shut off by the police. They do not result in less violent behavior. They do increase surveillance of those being policed. Trainings in implicit bias for police have shown no demonstrable effect. In Chicago, it was found that the officers accused of the abuses were actually leading that training. US cities collectively spend $100 billion a year on policing, while needed investments in education, healthcare, housing, and other critical programs go unfulfilled, particularly in poor communities and communities of color. New York City, for example, spends more on policing than it does on the Departments of Health, Homeless Services, Housing Preservation and Development, and Youth and Community Development combined. So a question for us to think about as folks who would like to see things change is it possible that our tax dollars could be invested in a more humane and just way? Next slide, if you would, Scott. So our president-elect says, I don't support defunding the police. And Scott and I were talking about this earlier today, that had Joe Biden come out and said that he favored defunding the police, he may not have been able to win the election. Because we need to reclaim the phrase, and we need to be advocates for the power of that phrase. He said, I don't support defunding the police. I support conditioning federal aid to police based on whether or not they meet certain basic standards of decency and honorableness, and in fact, are able to demonstrate that they can protect the community and everybody in the community. So I would put it to you that this year we have all seen several demonstrations of police not protecting the community and not looking out for the community and responding in ways that are not decent or honorable as members of the community have come out to protest. Also, you know, as I said when we were looking at the previous slide, some of the measures like the implicit bias training and body cameras have been shown to be completely ineffective. So one of our responsibilities as allies and accomplices might be to hold President-elect Biden's feet to the fire on these issues. Next slide, please. So less policing. These two examples come from the American Society of Friends, who are very active in this field. So one example is, you don't realize that your brake lights are working. Imagine that a city employee signals for you to pull over and asks if they can replace those bulbs for you on the spot so that nobody gets hurt, rather than issuing you a ticket and a fine. Another example, you are experiencing a mental health crisis. You're afraid. Imagine you call 311 and a first responder trained in mental health comes to your door. Within an hour, you're in a safe place with your consent and with follow-up plans, instead of dead in the street naked because you were having a mental health crisis. Yeah, Scott. Phew. She talks a lot.
Wow. Oh, I mean, Kate, it's so much to digest. You just did a brilliant job bringing that all together. So I will pose these discussion questions just to the group, and then I'm gonna pause the recording here until the very end. So some two questions that we thought Kate actually had four, and I was like, we are not going to be able to get through all four of these because they're so big. But some questions for us to consider and to discuss in this moment. Should police departments have some or all of their funding transferred to other services, like mental health services, like Kate just brought up? And secondly, what else might we do to reform police departments and repair harm that's been perpetrated upon BIPOC communities? So now we're heading back into the PowerPoint where some next steps and where we're going next in this series. So Kate, take it away.
Yeah, so one of the things that we, just based on the feedback we've been getting from people so far, and mindful of the fact that everybody is busy and everybody has a lot of things on their to-do lists, we wanted to start to kind of scaffold the learn more portion of our work so that you can take as big or as small a bite. If you want to understand this topic more and you've got 15 minutes, we have 3 different videos. You could go pick one of those and look at it, right? If you have 15 minutes or less. If you have an hour, we have a link to the original article about broken windows theory. We also have an episode of Hidden Brain on NPR, if you're familiar with that podcast, where Shankar Vedantam talks about where broken windows came from and how it went wrong. And he does interview George Kelling as part of that podcast. And then the policing campaign through the Center for Policing Equity, which I confess I did not know about until about 10 days ago. Blew my mind, the quantity of information on that website. So their new era of public safety, if you're interested in thinking more deeply about the idea of defunding the police or reallocating some of that money, there's some great resources there. Again, if you have an hour, right? Honestly, that website, you could probably get lost there for some time, but you could spend a very constructive hour. And if you still want more, then here are a couple of books that are diving into this topic in a much more rigorous way. So that's that, and that's in the PDF that Scott shared. And then Scott, you want to talk next steps?
You got it. So this is our homework for the next session coming up. Is that right, Kate? So there are 2 links here. We try to keep the homework light just to give you some preparation to enter the discussion for Monday, January 25th, where we're going to take this from policing to prosecution and how whites are treated differently in terms of prosecution as well. So there are two articles there that are hyperlinked within that PDF that I just dropped. And I think that's really it for us for today. I think I will leave it there. Kate, anything to add? Final thoughts, final words? Okay, well, thanks everyone.
I know we're not supposed to get a cookie for this, but you all get a cookie for showing up on Monday, the 28th of December.
And it's probably shaped like a candy cane with like frosting and sprinkles on it.